and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I wish Eid Mubarak to those of you celebrating, and I'd like to acknowledge that this is a difficult time in many places given the strains and stresses of the COVID pandemic. My name is Beth Woronyuk, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today. I'm the policy lead at the Equality Fund, a global organization based in Canada, supporting feminist and gender justice organizations and movements around the world. I'd like to thank the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development and ICAN, the International Civil Society Action Network, for convening us here today. We have a very, very exciting roundtable, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Last year marked the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council 1325, as I'm sure everyone on this call is aware. One of the really strong themes that emerged during those the celebrations last October was, despite some gains, progress has been too slow. There was a real frustration that peace is elusive, militarism continues to dominate, women's participation in formal peace processes is still not the norm. The understanding of gender dimensions of armed conflict, violent extremism, peace building are still not well recognized. And funding, that's what we're here to talk about today. Funding has not matched the rhetoric, especially funding for women-led peace building organizations. We saw in the Secretary General's report last fall that while overall bilateral aid going to fragile and conflict-affected states that supports gender equality is on the rise, funding flowing to women's organizations has stagnated. So we know this from what we're hearing from organizations on the ground, and the data is very clear on this fact. We also know that there are many, many concerns that COVID has made this worse. A recent survey by the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, 84% of respondents said that they feared for their existence. So 84% of women-led peace-building organizations that answered this survey said that they're not really sure they're going to be around next year. So we have a real challenge and an important discussion today. Here's how it's going to work. We're going to talk about the challenges, but then we're going to move on and we're going to focus on the solutions. We're going to focus on what's working. We're going to focus on what we're learning. We're going to focus on models that we can use to move forward. So we're going to have two discussions. The first one is on the challenges. And then, as I said, we're going to move on to solutions and the way forward. And to start each of these dialogues, a representative from ICAN will kick us off with some opening comments. And then we really want a discussion. To help us do this, we're joined by two very special commentators. We're joined by Abir Haji Ibrahim, who's from Syria, and a co-founder of the Mobardarun Network, and has extensive experience building peace, training peace ambassadors, bridging various groups within Syria. We have Katrin Wild, the executive director of the Channel Foundation, and Katrin guides the foundation's grant-making, advocacy, and collaboration efforts to promote and support women's human rights. And our third commentator is Krista House, who is Deputy Director in the Peace and Stabilization Operations Program at Global Affairs Canada, where she focuses on women, peace, and security programming. To help me out with these introductions, you can note that more information on these fabulous commentators will be posted in the chat. We've asked our commentators to keep their interventions short. So this is our challenge for today. How do we keep the conversation moving? And we hope to open the floor up to you, the audience members, for your questions, for your comments as we move forward. So to kick us off in our first discussion on obstacles and gaps, I'm going to turn the floor over to Sanam Narigi Anderlini. But we're also, as I'm introducing Sanam, we're going to put up pop in a poll for you to answer to get your thoughts on some of the challenges and gaps. So if we could pop the poll in, and then once you answer it, it should disappear so that you can see Sanam. To many of you, Sanam needs no introduction. She's been a powerhouse and a respected leader of the women, peace and security field for years and years. She's the founder and co-CEO of ICAN and the director of the Center on Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics. So over to you to get us started, Sanam.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to the Stockholm Forum and to Krista and Katrine and Abir and everyone for joining us. I know it's a busy schedule, so it's great to have you here. I'm going to go straight into this issue. You know, I've been doing this work for over 20 years, and funding was always a problem. And last year we published a report called Financing Women's Peace Work. And basically what we were trying to do was to unpack where the obstacles are. And I'm going to give you sort of the top headline ones because it's kind of, when I'll say it, you'll realize it's obvious, but you realize how much of a problem it is, right? So for years we were struggling to say, can we get funding to women's organizations, recognize that women exist, right? That part of the conversation has moved quite far along in the last 20 years. The part that is really still a challenge is, in a way, twofold for us. One is peace building, women's peace building generally, but specifically understanding that we're not generically just saying do gendered work and gendered work is everything and anything, but specifically that we have women who emerge as peace builders and peace actors doing mediation work, doing humanitarian work, really at that really front sharp end of these issues in conflict and fragile spaces. They are not the majority. They're actually quite a tiny minority in the realm of activism and in women's movements, generally speaking, because it's really dangerous work. But they're doing something really pivotal and essential. And they have been the engine and the motor behind the WPS agenda ever since I was in this, started back in the 1990s around this field. So we need to, first of all, recognize that these people exist, that they have organizations. And then what's the value added? And this is the part that is important. 5-6 years ago, we were in England. The British had supported our efforts to do a pilot fund, which has now become the Innovative Peace Fund. And thank you to Canada for supporting the Innovative Peace Fund at ICAN. But when we took our partners there, and everybody kept telling me about, you know, the appetite for risk is low. And I couldn't understand what they meant by risk. Who was risky? Was I risky? Was Abir risky? Was my partner Fatima Al-Bahadli, who was working on the ground in Iraq, risky? Who is risky? And I switched it around and I said, wait a second, these are people who are putting their own lives on the line to deal with extremists, to deal with conflict on the ground, to deal with violent actors, et cetera, et cetera. They have trust. They have built an enormous sort of reserve of trusted relationships with the government, with local interlocutors, with local communities, with marginalized groups, with armed groups, et cetera. And instead of thinking, what is our appetite for risk, we should be thinking about what is our appetite for trust. And we should be investing in that trust. And frankly speaking, the money that we disperse to our partners is the icing on the cake, because what they have, an international organization will never have. That trust that they have. And the COVID era really showed this, because when COVID happened, all of us were stuck at home and the international community disappeared from fragile states. Who ran to the problem to do PPE and hygiene and food and gender-based violence and dealing with extremism? It was the women peace builders on the ground. It was types of people who are in the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, WASP, our network, and who are part of our community. And we have to value that they as individuals, their organizations as entities on the ground are locally rooted. And when we capacitate them and we support them, they are there to respond to all sorts of crises and the complexity of crises. So it's that shifting that needs to happen. And that paradigm shift, I think, still hasn't hit the depth of understanding in the peace and security community. And in the women's movements, we're still struggling because sometimes they don't even see us as doing women's rights work. even though the rights element is both embedded in the approaches that we take, but also in the principle of I have a right to work on security issues, or my partners have. So these are the things. I just want to end with a couple of statistics in terms of how difficult this problem is. In Syria, 75% of the humanitarian assistance that was being delivered was delivered by local organizations, by local Syrian organizations. Yet they only received 0.3% of the direct grants and only 9.3% of indirect cash funding. So they're doing 75% of the work. And in Africa, 2.1% of funding goes to local civil society organizations. 97.9% goes to international organizations. They then subcontract 87% of that to the local organizations. Right. But you can bet, and again, our research shows that the local organizations don't get money to do organizational work. They don't get the overheads. They don't even get to understand that a grant may start at $10 million here in the US, but for their country, by the time they get it, it's $100,000. Right. So there's this huge discrepancy. And part of our point is that it's not about adding new money, it's actually using the money more effectively and being much more, recognizing the work, but also being much more equitable. And we'll come to the solutions and reports, but we have a series of what not to do's, and then a series of what to do's and how to do them in terms of really shifting these paradigms. Not in a, we don't want to bust everything open and change everything overnight, but we're saying there are lots of small tweaks that can be made in the contractual arrangements, in the recognition, in the requests and so forth, that will really shift the paradigm and transform the space. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanam. Thank you for kicking us off with that really sharp presentation on what some of the real issues are. Can we put the poll up before I go to our commentators? Could we get the right results of the poll? And while we're having a look, Abir, I'm going to give you notice that I'm going to go to you first. So interesting for the donors, your biggest challenges, we see that it is the very first one, that there are administrative barriers and insufficient resources for managing smaller grants. So thank you for that poll. And we do have the risk comment that Sanam was mentioning coming in second there. But Abir, can I go to you first for some really quick observations to follow up to follow on Sanam's comments? What is this like for you in your work? What do these statistics mean in your daily work?
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor to talk about this. Actually, you feel at the end as a local organization, or even like a woman trying to build peace, as if you are in a sandwich. So you are squeezed between two main layers. The over compliance, which is bringing from the donors outside, and all these huge vettings and processes and issues that you need to tackle during your work. And then you have your country regulations and high risk of security and working in a war zone. And you need to do the impact, which is the slice of meat that you need to produce for the community and to work with the community. So you feel all the time that there's a huge fearness around the globe on how we are going to fund this small women-led organization. They might not have the experience. They need lots of competencies to make it forward. But with that risk, they reduce the impact that we are going to deliver in our country, and to do more and better peace initiatives on the ground. So you feel that we are squeezed in these sandwiches, and in the same time, you feel yourself as if it's something ridiculous when you are obliged, for example, to do a vetting for a falafel provider or sandwiches provider twice 1 month. So you make sure that he's not money laundering his sandwiches that you are using in your coffee breaks. And in the same time, you need to moderate between two ethnic groups having a great conflict often over a land or properties, and you have to do this both. So everyone is happy at the end, but at the end you are not happy because you are spending much more time in doing the vetting over the falafel more than giving the proper time to be a very good mediator in your community. So it's a huge challenge. Then it comes to the head cost, when there is a limitation for the head cost, where the UN entities and the huge INGOs take the great head cost comparing with on what we are having on the ground. So the statistics are not a surprising issues for me. I've been doing that for the last 10 years, and I have dedicated my whole life to do that. Eventually, I've been looking for like a window to have like more understanding from the international community about what doesn't mean really to work in a war zone, and how we can overcome these obstacles.
Great. Thank you. That's a very, very vivid portrayal of some of the challenges that that groups like yours face. Katrin, I'm wondering if I can call you in here. We often hear philanthropy is more agile, has different flexibility that bilateral assistance doesn't have. What, from your perspective, what are some of the key challenges or gaps?
Well, thank you, Beth, and I want to thank ICAN for inviting me to participate in this forum, and particularly their report resonates with our experience as a small private foundation based in the United States. And I think as we'll discuss later, their recommendations are spot on. We often find in the circles that we move in that there's still a perception that funding peacebuilding is really something that's only for bilateral agencies and not something for private foundations to even consider. I think there's a larger issue about even misunderstandings about what peacebuilding looks like. I think Sanam and Abir have both given some amazing examples that there's a really wide array of vital activities that can be considered under that umbrella. We found that over the years, even quite small grants, targeted grants, can have incredible impact and ripples over the years. So I definitely want to convey that hopeful message to everybody. Also early grants early on in a process, and flexible grants. Probably this area more than any of our other funding areas, we've had to be quite flexible around timelines and reporting because situation shifts so rapidly. We've just made a recent grant towards funding a women's peace forum in Afghanistan. As we all know, who are observing that process from afar, that's changing week by week. And so, you know, that's something that we understand because we have a long-term vision. So anyway, I look forward to getting more into some of the solutions as we continue the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for moving us into solutions so early. I think it's really positive to hear your experience of the things that have worked. Krista, as a government representative from Global Affairs Canada, what resonated and what Sanam had to say for you?
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to ICAN and CIPRI for organizing this event. Truly appreciate being included in the discussion. I think what really resonated with what Sanam was saying was that need and that paradigm shift to move to the trust appetite. And at Global Affairs, within our Women, Peace and Security programming, we've really tried to look at broadening that ecosystem, that peace-building ecosystem that I think we'll pick up on in our next discussion. But looking at the recommendations that came out from the report that Sanam mentioned, we're also very lucky in Canada. We have strong political will, right? And that's one of the things that I would definitely highlight as one of those solutions / models that we'll get into as well. You know, 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago now, Canada announced its Feminist International Assistance Policy, which has at its very heart changing systems and practices that perpetuate inequality. And so now more than ever, Canada is really committed to contributing to the peace and security agenda. I'll talk a little bit more later, but just to highlight that we're also a proud supporter of Generation Equality Forum And recently in March, at the Mexico Generation Equality Forum, the Global Alliance for Sustainable Feminist Movements was announced. So this is something that we're quite excited about. This would make explicit commitments to supporting and funding women's rights organizations and feminist movements, especially in the Global South. But also includes really important aspects of exchanging and implementing best practices and feminist funding principles and building on existing funding modalities. I think one of the biggest things for donors too, you saw it in the poll right there, the administrative burdens and insufficient funding. But I think where donors as a whole can make, I think, significant strides is making real, tangible, and pragmatic progress on that funding, and it has to be backed by political will. So perhaps I'll leave it there. I can go into a lot more, but I'm very keen to hear from other speakers. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you for the mention of some of the global efforts underway to rethink and to expand the pool of funding. I think Sana made an important point that it's how we use the existing money, but there's also this need for broader changes. Abir, I'm going to go back to you before we see if there's anyone from the floor. And if you'd like to raise your hand or if you'd like to put your name in the chat, we'll try to take an intervention from the floor after Abir. What does trust has come up in a number of points. For you, what would this trust from funders look like? What would this involve from your perspective?
Actually, we have we were so lucky because at the beginning of the Syrian revolution or crisis, we've been surrounded by very good donors who helped us actually, they trusted us from the beginning, such as the CEDA Sweden, the Canadian, and ICAN, the others, Phonetic FINA in a certain moment where we've been provided a fund where we can have a space to take our own decisions. So first, we have our free space to decide what to do. There is no imposing agenda over us, and there is no asking to do or not to do list. So there wasn't any list came from our donors to do or not to do. That's one. The second, we have this more than 35% from the fund to develop our internal learning and internal knowledge. So within the work that we are doing in the community, we have this 35 to 40% where we have like a very good building our own internal capacity in terms of policies, in terms of procedures, in terms of what does it mean to be a peace builder process. So that was one. Our freedom and our free space to decide what to do. Then our ability to move within this fund to have our internal learning and knowledge base. And we've been able to do like a long learning journey without someone keep coming to us and say, look, in 6 months, you are going to have an impact. No, what? In Syria, in 6 months, you have to have an impact. So you have our space. We have this long duration of funding opportunities, and then we have the tools with us. The tools that mean we do know how to do our compliances and our vetting process. We do see that there is a huge responsibility over our shoulders that we have to provide the international community the best practices on how we are using this tax money at the end to build our internal structure. So you have the tool kits inside your internal organization. You have this free space to do whatever you want and to strategize according to your local needs. And you have also the trust in taking the decisions inside. So these three main factors helped Mubadiru to have like a grow in a horizontal way, and in the same time to build a very good grassroots organization, which also could be globally connected and in the same time locally engaged.
We're we're already getting into some of the solutions, some of the elements moving forward. So Katrin, can I call on you to respond to that? You mentioned earlier that small grants can have a real ripple, that they can have a real impact. And Abir has added to that in some of the other pieces, the flexibility, the ability to control where the money goes. Are there other lessons that you've learned on how as a funder you can build in those kinds of attributes that Abir was mentioning?
Well, I definitely think, you know, it obviously goes back to the trust index that Sanam mentioned. I think partly it's really also realizing that none of these groups are operating in isolation. They're part of a larger ecosystem typically. Are there ways that you can help ensure that they have connections to other groups? Are there ways that you can help ensure that they have access to other funding, that they're able to have a spotlight shown on their work? So many of these groups have, because they've been thrust into the situation, typically do not have any communications or media training or capacity. And that's precisely at the time when their voice could be so vital to be heard, not only at the peace tables, but in the society at large and at the global level as well. You know, that's something that we've seen time and time again, that there's a media communications capacity issue that could be really vital to ensure their voices are heard. I know ICAN had an important project that was trying to work on, it was called What the Women Say. It was just a great title because it really was like, we're not hearing from these women and we're still sadly not hearing from them. So I think that communications and media piece is one thing I would like to highlight.
Great, thanks. Krista, a final comment from you on this section. You've mentioned the political will as being absolutely essential to deliver this kind of funding. And Katrin has talked about some of the other non-financial supports or supporting that less, you know, the things you can't count. I'm wondering if you have lessons learned on that side of the funding as well.
Sure, thank you, Beth. Just picking up on what Katrin was mentioning about the flexibility in the funding, and we've been engaged in a number of discussions with women's organizations over the last year, especially in the context of the pandemic, but also in the lead up to the anniversary of 1325. And what we're hearing time and time again is two or three things that I'll highlight. Definitely echoing the media capacity, but also support to activities that typically large donors may not be as willing or able to support. And those are things around cybersecurity and cyber knowledge and technical capacity. Looking at protection aspects and paying for that full spectrum of protection, whether it's the women at the very, very grassroots level, all the way to sort of technical accompaniment to peace talks and negotiations. So those are all things that we as a donor are striving to incorporate into the grants and the projects that we are looking at supporting in the context of our Women Peace Builders envelope. So critically important aspects as well to build on what Katrin was mentioning.
Great, thank you for that. I haven't seen any raised hands. Anyone in the chat. Oh, Clara, I'll give you the floor for just a quick 2 minutes and then we'll move on to solutions. So thank you. You have the mic, Clara.
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm Clara Backman. I'm with the Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation, and we have been supporting women-led organizations in conflict-affected countries for 28 years. So I'll try to just share a few lessons learned from my organization. And I think I'm echoing all of the previous speakers and your excellent points. But I think just really linking to what Abir said on long-term support, one challenge for us has always been to sort of resist donor-driven shifts in funding and just sticking it out for our partner organizations throughout the conflict cycle, not only supporting the activities that kind of result in perhaps the actual increase in the women around the table, but actually making sure that that participation is meaningful in the long run, both before and after the actual peace process is happening. And then secondly, on the topic of security and protection, I think the double security that women peace builders live, both as peace builders, but also as part of women's movement, and how that is affected by shrinking space and anti-gender movements, and that it is a difference funding women's movements in that regard, because it's very also affected by conservative movements and the anti-gender trends that we are seeing now. And you have to also fund protection and security online and offline for women activists to be able to resist that. And then just lastly, I think we know from our experience, and all of the other speakers also know, that like supporting the local and the national movements is what works in the long run, what gives results. So how do also we, as an intermediary funder, sort of based in the global north, how do we avoid also adding to an unequal power structure and taking the place of our partners, which is a challenge that I think that we should also be sort of open and honest about, to also avoid sort of professionalizing work on peace building, the same way that I think that work on gender equality has in a way become professionalized in a way that risks sort of pushing out local activists. So, but I look forward to joining in the conversation again and talking about solutions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for highlighting that point about power that I think is so important when we're talking about money, because it's intrinsically linked to these discussions. So now I'm going to give the floor back to you for a quick wrap up on this, and then we're going to go to the next dialogue on solutions, even though we've already started to see some of these solutions come out, which is great.
Thank you. I just wanted to, on the kind of challenges side of the story and why it was that we set up the Innovative Peace Fund at ICAN. One of the things that is really important to recognize when you're dealing with conflict in fragile states is that funding through multilateral institutions has political implications, right? They may not, I mean, we've seen places where in certain countries there hasn't been a willingness to fund, or that multilateral institutions may need to tell governments that they're funding in those countries, funding local organizations. And our local partners are saying, but we have a problem with the government, right? It actually creates more insecurity. So the issue of setting up the independent fund for us was partly to say, we need to be able to have direct access and support, registered organizations as they need it. Secondly, we need to understand that it's not just a funding relationship, it's a personal solidarity. If someone's in trouble, they need to have someone that they can contact, and there's that trust there as well. So the support is much more tailored and much more specific. And it's the issue of saying we need the big funds, but we also need the small tailored funds. And then finally, when we're talking about trust, it's the way we see it is that we go based on, I do what I can, ICAN does what it can do. And we believe our partners can do what they can do. We don't need to have offices everywhere because that's a big cost. Our partners are there. So let them be doing the work on the ground. They ask us to do the administrative stuff internationally, or the advocacy or the connecting, but it's a division of labor based on comparative strengths. And again, it makes it a much richer, much more a resilient community of practice, but also much more effective on the ground in terms of enabling the independence of these groups to carry on their work. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken in terms of the trust element on both sides as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So we've heard a lot about some of the different challenges, the need for trust, some of the challenges in funding small groups, some of the administrative challenges, the political nature, the insecurity, lots of obstacles. But we also, Frans, we anticipated you a little bit in terms of you coming in to share with us the innovative peace tools, the Innovative Peace Fund and ICAN's tools on funding. So if we could pop the second poll in while I'm introducing France. So France is can we get the poll from our tech support? Excellent. So if you could click that, and now we're asking about grant recipients. What has worked for you? And we've got 3 options for you to consider there. And while you're doing that, I'd just like to mention that France is the program director at ICAN with responsibility for managing the Innovative Peace Fund and supporting partners. And France brings a long-term expertise to this of working, providing training, providing support, and has also brought a really interesting perspective to trying to build solutions. And so this is what we're going to have an introduction now from France of the work that ICAN has been doing in this area. And we'll look at the results of the poll when France has concluded her opening remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Beth. And thank you to all the other contributions which teed up so well the discussion around solutions. I would love to first, just to follow on what Sanam had said, tell you a little bit about the Ipf Fund, the Innovative Peace Fund, and how it was developed with an aim towards really addressing a lot of the challenges that have been raised in terms of the trust, the flexibility, the reaching small local organizations. So when we initiated the IPF in 2015, and so it still remains the only independent multi-donor global grant making mechanism that is truly just dedicated to women-led organizations that are working on peace building and PCVE work in conflict and crisis contexts. What is the beauty of the IPF is that it allows us to channel small to medium grants to organizations that otherwise might not have an opportunity or access to these types of funding. So we really tried to address the issues that were raised before in terms of how do we access local funds, and to take a lot of the administrative burdens that the big donors had talked about. And actually, I think that was one of the first things that was mentioned, or the top priority on the issues from the poll before, was the administrative burdens and insufficient resources for managing smaller grants. So we really tried to do that at the IPF by taking these larger funds and being able to break them up for the smaller organizations that otherwise wouldn't have access to them. The types of partners that we support that are engaged in peace building and PCVE work ranges from everything from de-radicalization and reintegration to participation and advocacy around peace and security processes, to responding to crises. We did a lot of work in COVID last year, and which continues this year, but then also to kind of some of the psychosocial support and protection that was mentioned a little bit earlier by Abir and some of the others. And so what we're really doing here, as Sanam said, is investing in trust. And we do that by allowing our partners to define their priorities and their interventions. And essentially, they, as long as it falls within the broader scope of women peace building and PCVE work, they are able to define whatever they believe is most important to address the crises that they're seeing and the problems that they're seeing in their communities. We just then support them to make sure their proposal and their interventions are as strong as possible, and in many ways that are reasonable. We find so often that partners feel like they have to propose 50 activities in a year-long project because they feel this pressure by donors. That's not at all the case, right? And really, they should look at what they have the capacity for, what they can support their staff for, how they can support their institution. And this is kind of the freedom that Abir had mentioned before, that we try to provide to the partners. We have been able to do a lot of advocacy, as Krista knows, and others, around providing more flexible funding. And it's flexible in 2 ways. One, in terms of what they can actually support with the funds. And this is where we focus on the institutional and organizational support. So it's staffing, it's equipment, it's ensuring that they are keeping their offices open and they have a place to work and go. It's also the cyber knowledge and security that Krista had mentioned before, and the protection that Clara had mentioned. These are all important factors that need to be integrated into every budget and every proposal, instead of just being focused on activities, it needs to consider the institutional needs of that organization. And there are a lot. And then, of course, we're able to offer a lot of strategic guidance and technical assistance because the IPF is part of ICAN. And so we do gender trainings, we do mediation, and if we can't do it in-house, we often do, then we have good resources and a really great network through the WASP community. So all of the partners to the IPF get this peer-to-peer exchange with others who have, can you all hear me? It says my internet is going down. Okay.
You had a bit of wobbly, but you're okay.
Okay, let me know. I can always go off video if it gets bad. But so yeah, so I just wanted to give a quick introduction to the IPF. We, in the last 5 years, up until the end of 2020, have been able to give out 4.2 million in 24 countries globally, from the South to Middle East, Africa, and about 124 grants. So, and I would love, if I have just a couple minutes, Beth, to just briefly introduce the recommendations that we had in the paper that Sanam had mentioned, where we start off with a lot of identifying the issues. And then what we did is, after we'd identified the problems and the obstacles, we started to look at how we can address them in a more technical way. And so we started to kind of organize and categorize these hurdles to understand where and why they were cropping up. And what we saw is that, in addition to the series of technical issues that we were facing and that our partners are facing in terms of just contracts and implementation period and reporting, there were also these top level issues, and essentially leading to what Krista had mentioned before in terms of the political will. The top level issues being recognition of women's work in peacebuilding and PCVE, or allowing, developing priorities and programming without true integration, not just consultation, but integration of women's peacebuilding organizations. So what we did was that we realized that despite all the practical guidance that we had developed for kind of streamlining processes and building institutional strength, that none of this would actually be possible if the overall ecosystem around them isn't working. So you can't fix those smaller technical issues until you fix the bigger problems. So we, as you'll see in our recommendations, we basically categorize them into 4 groups, which are organized by what not to do. And then underneath that, it's under each what not to do is a recommendation for better practices of what to do. And then that is broken down into really specific operational recommendations that are meant to make the guidance truly tangible and easy to implement. And there are 45 recommendations, so I certainly won't go through all of them, but we hope you'll get a chance to read them. And I think that Maya has posted the link to the recommendations in the chat, if you can take a look. But the 4 main categories are basically, 1 is aligning funding priorities with existing commitments to WPS. So this refers to the political will and the essentially putting the money where the mouth is in terms of what a lot of donors are saying they want to do. Now we need to be able to do it. And that's about ensuring that resources are going to local groups with experience, trust, and expertise in gendered peace building, but that are also already active on the ground. I would, and maybe I will later, would love to be able to give you some specific examples of each of these, but for now, I'll just give you a brief overview of what the groupings are. So the second of the 4 is about creating equitable relationships. We've all talked about this, but essentially the intention is to create a more balanced relationship between donors and partners, which is more fair, which is more equal, and which can be done really by improving the transparency of the whole grant process to ensure that the locally developed concepts and practices are really properly attributed to local organizations and aren't appropriated by donors or international organizations that we've mentioned before have kind of implementing partners on the ground. The 3rd and the 4th get to the more specific technical guidance that we mentioned earlier. The 3rd being valuing the strengthening of organizational sustainability in local context. This means doing that shift, which we discussed with the IPF, of shifting the focus to be more on building the institutional strength and sustainability of these organizations rather than just on completing activities or project outputs, right? We recognize, as you'll see in our recommendations, that all donors are accountable to their sources of money. So each of our recommendations really strives to strike that balance between what the donors' obligations are to their stakeholders, as well as really prioritizing the institutional needs of the women peacebuilding organizations. And then the last one we had is really specific and technical, and it's about streamlining grant processes. And this gives some really operational advice on how you can reduce rigid program and fiscal requirements that end up negatively affecting the ability of the women peacebuilders to actually achieve impact, right? And so we have just a series of recommendations, look at how you can change some of the reporting, some of the implementation, some of the things that Abir mentioned earlier about how donors ask for impact just a couple months after the project has been done. So hopefully we'll be able to get a bit more into these as the discussion progresses. Thanks, Beth.
Thanks so much, France. And Maya has posted a link to the report, to the recommendations in the chat. And it's a great, great document. I really encourage people to have a look, to do some reflection. And so thank you for that. And thank you for the overview of the Innovative Peace Fund as a really excellent example of how funding can actually move to address address all of the concerns people outlined in the earlier part. We have about 25 minutes left, and I'd like to, if you raise your hand, I'd like to hear from the people around our virtual table here, what your solutions have been. Do you have ways that those different categories that Frances outlined that you found a way to work in here? Abir, could I though first turn to you, and then Rola, I see you, I'll call on you next. But Abir, you talked a little bit about what trust means. Do you have any other recommendations of things that you've seen work that funders could do? What kind of solutions would you like to put on the table?
Yes, actually, I want to continue what France was saying about the support and building the partnerships between the donors and the grantees, as we say. I do remember like a small incident when I was brought for a Syrian civil society rooms in Geneva in the peace talks. I found myself alone within 12 men at that time. And I didn't know what to do. So the first thing I thought about it, that two from our main donors to speak with. One of them is Sanam, and the others is Mary from SIDA Sweden, that time the program manager. I said to them, look, ladies, I'm in the middle of nowhere and I don't know what to do. So the kind of the support these two ladies gave me through emails, through talking to me, through giving me the technical support at that exact moment made a huge change for my contribution in that very track one important platform. So it's not only giving money, it's also giving support to be engaged and to be better engaged in multi-tracks. And building that kind of partnerships is a little bit challenging for the money comes from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because you see that there's no time for the officers who are engaged in getting the fund to speak to you, to talk to you, and to bring you into a platform where you can bring your voices and your learnings out for everyone. Then the monitoring and evaluation and the audit. Especially the audit. We need to look deeply about what kind of audit we need to provide for the CBOs. It's not blaming and shaming process. It's a learning how to do things better. It's the monitoring and evaluation and learning together. It's not like putting all the obstacles and the challenges and saying, look, yeah, whatever you are doing in this war zone, it's nothing, because at the end you did this 25 faults during the operation, and we are going to have eligible cost against you for that. That kind of mindset of like punishing and auditing, it's not the way that we are doing the peace building. we need to upgrade it to the level of the learnings for these CBOs. So we do know and acknowledge the faults and the things that need to be better, but it's a learning process for them and a recommendation to overcome it in the next reporting. The concept itself needs to be changed somehow. Then the networks and the change with the exchange of experiences with the other conflict countries. I do feel less traumatized when I see the excellent work of Visaka is doing in another country, or my colleagues are doing in another way, in Philippines, in Rwanda, in Sierra Leone, wherever. I do need such a support coming from the peace builders, the women peace builders who are doing the same great job everywhere, because it's given me enthusiasm to continue. It gives me the support that I need, and it gives me that look, you are not the only one, and the Syrian crisis is not the only one. Look about Colombia, what's happened, the post-conflict for women, how it went, the Yemenis civil society rooms, what they are doing. So we need also to bring inside our work the networking with the other countries and how we could learn from each other and build this kind of women peace building alliances who have this powerful will to continue. And we continue while we are working together. So coming back to building this kind of relation, I do remember then when we were like looking to have like our board, we thought that why not asking one of the donors to come to our board members, because it's a kind of building relations and see everything as it is. This is how we are doing work, and we are very open to learn. And this is how we managed to build a very good trust with, I think, from our side with our donors. And we don't see even the word donor. We don't actually use it in our work. Often we say our partners, because we do think it's like not only the money, it's the money, the experience, the expertise, the network, the engagement, the support to be engaged and to learn together how it's packing everything together.
You are a clear communicator on what that complete package of funding really should look like. Thank you for that. The solidarity, the peer support, the networking, looking at monitoring and evaluation as learning rather than top-down critiques or harsh judgments. Thank you for that. I think those are all really important points. I've lost my person with the hand up in the from the audience. Rola, there you are. So could I turn the floor over to you for a short, if I can ask you for short so we can hear from as many people as possible. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. My name is Rola Al-Masri. I am working with the Women International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm humbled to be speaking after Abir, just to share also from our experience at Ipf what we're doing to support women rights organizations inside Syria. With this specific context, how hard it is to support the women rights organizations and the feminist peace builders and the feminist movement vis-a-vis all the increased scrutiny from back donor organizations with all the challenges in terms of channeling funds. Quickly, just to share with you the model that we adopted in terms of supporting the organizations. So it's definitely, as Abir was saying, as part of being a kind of a packaged support. So we provide the flexible funding for organizations, not only the women rights organizations, but also targeting those who are newly established or even unregistered, because of the fact that they are facing all of these challenges, not because they don't want to register, but because of all the crackdown against these organizations in different areas and inside Syria, but also in neighboring countries. So we have, through this, our niche support specifically targeting these those frontliners who would want to have these to sustain their work and their efforts on the front line. And with that, we make sure that this funding is accompanied hand in hand with a very kind of tailored and organic capacity building and technical support based on their needs, either at the institutional level, as France was saying, just to ensure that it is not an activity-based support, but rather that would support the agendas, the feminist agendas of these organizations that wouldn't otherwise either overburdened with reporting every other month, or by having to adapt to the shift in donor priorities. So they focus their work mostly on the work that they think is much needed to be brought up and be always on the table as feminist priorities. And with that comes also the spaces for solidarity, for support, for convening, for plotting, feminist plotting around the issues that needs to be always also on the table. And given that WILPF is present strategically in Geneva and in New York with offices in these two spaces, so we also provide, access to our partners to these spaces, multilateral systems for advocacy and for making sure that their voices are heard. So, and then just to tap on one element that quickly on what Abir was saying in terms of feminist male. So we definitely approach the process as power with and not power over. So everything that has to do with capturing the lessons learned, how we can improve ourselves and our approach, how partners can help us also in this process. Together we learn how to enhance this is something we are always keen to do reflections on. And thank you so much for this space and for having to listen into everyone's insights on that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Rola. And maybe you could put, if you have a link to a website or documentation in the chat, I think people would be really interested to hear more about how you work. I think the more models we hear, the more we hear that this is possible to do in different areas, the better off we are. I'm wondering, Krista or Katrin, if I could turn to either of you to talk a little bit either about monitoring and evaluation. Have you learned anything there, or in some of the reporting requirements, or if there is another theme that's come up in this latest round of conversations that you'd like to pick up on. Katrin, maybe over to you first. I see you nodding.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Well, I just wanted to add 2 points. One was building on what Abir said. Not only does there need to be, cross-regional solidarity and sharing of solutions between women's rights organizations and peace-building organizations, the same could be said for donors. There needs to be a lot more collaboration and discussion. And so I just wanted to mention, we're part of the Peace and Security Funders Group, which has some excellent resources that would be helpful for everyone here. They do an annual peace funding index. And that leads me to my second point. In 2019, the largest funder in their, all the folks that they surveyed of women peace building activities was actually the Global Fund for Women. And so I want to mention the importance of women's funds, who are at this point in almost every region. Sometimes they're regionally focused, sometimes they're country specific, but they are very close to the ground. They're able to make small direct grants to women's peace building groups. And so I think they're definitely a very positive model that should not be overlooked. The other thing was, we're part of POWER, which is shorthand for Philanthropy Advancing Women's Human Rights, which is several large private institutions focused on supporting women's human rights. And within that, there's 2 projects that I think are relevant. One, which is a sort of streamlining project, a pilot that we're working on to do common application and reporting. So right now we're piloting it with women's funds so that they don't have to do 12 different proposals and 12 different reports, but how about if they could do one? And so many of us are asking for the same thing. So that can help save time for women peace builders to focus on more vital activities. The other thing is there's a pooled fund, the strategic, it's about leveraging resources. What I've learned from being part of that pooled fund advisory group is that the requirements for organizations to go for larger pots of money, particularly from bilaterals, they're very, very challenging requirements. And so that pooled fund has been set up specifically to give rapid extra response funds two organizations that are trying to go after some of those larger pots of funding that have very strict requirements. So those are a couple of other possibilities out there I wanted to make sure to mention.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's really interesting to hear about the initiatives donors are taking, either collectively or individually, to overcome some of these as well. And just thank you for the shout out for women's funds, and to say the Equality Fund is a member of Prospera, the network of women's funds, and there's certainly lots and lots of really interesting practices, and a lot of the funding that Women's Fund do is totally aligned with the kinds of goals we've been talking about, and also a commitment to this joint advocacy to break down some of these barriers. Krista, just to you, and then to Sanam. If there's been a number of comments about bilateral funders being perhaps more demanding or having more obstacles, or are there lessons that you're learning or points that you'd like to throw into this discussion?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Beth. And wanted to highlight, getting back to the comment around broadening the ecosystem and the perhaps focus more on the larger UN agencies and grants. And we've heard that over the last year. And one of our attempts to broaden that ecosystem of women peace builders is to really identify a gap in our own programming, where we thought we hadn't made as much commitments. And that's really at the grassroots local organizations level. And so to help address that gap, in October, our foreign minister announced a dedicated $5 million envelope specifically to support local grassroots women's organizations. And we also heard a lot of feedback in speaking with folks like Beth and with other organizations. And I thought I would just highlight just a few things that we're taking into account when we're looking at possible organizations to support through this envelope. So we've heard the need for flexible funding, but that also requires flexible arrangements and contracts, and really trying to look at where can we make those tangible differences, and where we're seeing where we as a donor can make those differences are little, it sounds like little things, but I know Abir would probably agree that things like extending the period of time from the completion of activities to the actual end date, allowing the partner to have that time. So those are things that we're incorporating into our agreements. Also, we mentioned before some of the budget items that typically we haven't always supported, but looking at ICAN's recommendations around psychosocial and emotional support. And if they haven't put it in the budget, to ask why. And I think that's another important part, because a lot of organizations are sometimes afraid to ask, or not being explicit in their budget around these budget items, and working with those organizations to ensure that they know that it's okay to ask for that money. Also looking at slightly longer term, of course, as Beth mentioned, and as others mentioned, we as a member state donor will always be constrained by our shifts in political priorities, but at the same time, we can extend those standard project timelines longer than we have in the past. I wanted to just make a quick shout out to a process that we have within Global Affairs Canada that is available to our partners. And it sounds like a very heavily bureaucratic process, but it's a financial capacity building assessment. And we've done that with ICAN. We've done that with a lot of our partners. But it's something that, it's a deep dive into the wonderful world of bureaucratic, financial instruments, but it really helps the partners understand why we're asking certain things, how we can sort of be flexible and work within the confines of our own restrictions. So just wanted to highlight that. And we're really hoping that within this $5 million envelope, we can provide some of that technical capacity to some of those smaller grassroots organizations, and really help to bring those on board and provide them with that support that they may not otherwise get, say, from the larger UN agencies. So wanted to just highlight that, Beth, and I'll pass it back over to you. Thanks so much.
That's great. And I think, as France mentioned, we have to get into those really nitty-gritty details of timing, of audits, of even things like timesheets. Are they required, as well as the big, I see a shaking of head. Timesheets can be one of the most awful things that organizations have to deal with. But then also the big political context of how those decisions play out. So over to our ICAN colleagues for some more comments. Sanam, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to just to give a sort of a picture of a day when when we at ICAN are thinking about, you know, our partners, the work that we're doing, the funding. But on any given day, we will need to have understanding of the legal frameworks and the contractual arrangements that 6 different countries impose on us because of we love them, we love our partners, but it's literally, it's like the rules that Canada has versus the rules that Germany has versus the rules that Norway has, right? So it's kind of constant, and then these rules change. Just as you get to know them, you know, they change, right? Secondly, currency exchanges. Last year, I had to look at the price of oil and what was happening to the price of oil as COVID was hitting, because the price of oil affects the Norwegian krone, and the Norwegian krone is part of our basket of funding that comes, and you make, you know, you put a budget, but then what, and again, take 6 currencies and do this, right? So this is just on the sort of administrative, let alone the kind of the financial year end require, you know, it's like one is December, one is March, one is June, one. So I sometimes wonder whether our private sector partner friends, you know, people who we want to engage the private sector, but whether there's actually an understanding of the level and depth of expertise that is needed to run international nonprofits right now, or the kind of work that Abir did, because Abir is also dealing with this, or other partners are dealing with this on the ground. So and that's not even the substantive side. That's not even getting a call at 8 o'clock at night from a partner who says, I'm just been stuck in, you know, Cairo airport and they won't let me in, and I feel insecure. Right. So this is where, for us, it's this thing of saying the community that we have is not just about a grant. It's really a personal relationship. It's professional relationships, and it's institutional relationships. And the longevity factor really matters, because our relationship with Canada has extended over the years so that it's advisory on both sides. We can give advice and they can give advice. Our support with the Channel Foundation, it started with a $25,000 grant going back, you know, 8-9 years ago. That investment in trust in us has now become, you know, my math is not very good, but it's now at least 150 times what they gave us. And then when you take that out and you say, okay, well, we gave a small grant to a partner in Nigeria, we gave a small grant to a partner in Sri Lanka and helped them with our institutional capacity. And they have now gone and leveraged funding from the Open Society Foundation or from other donors. It really makes that investment in the individuals and in the small organizations that are committed to deep practice, leverages in all sorts of ways that is really hard to see. But it really makes a difference when you understand the kind of the human beings at the heart of it, and the fact that they care and what commitment, and the fact that they don't have an exit strategy. It's not that Abir is doing Syria today and she's going to jump off to, you know, West Africa tomorrow. She's Syria. So these are the sort of nuances that we don't often talk about, but it's kind of part of our daily life and existence as we're trying to straddle these issues. Thank you.
I think your day in a life, and I think Abir's day in the life, that would make a great post for us all to read and learn from. France, you wanted the mic too, and I think we unfortunately, even though we could go on so much longer, it's so rich. We only have a few minutes left, but France, over to, and I think we didn't get the poll results. I don't think we put the final tally up. So if we could get that from what's the most conducive for effective peace building interventions? That really ties in with Sanam's point just now. The equitable and long-term relationships with donors is, you know, more than half the people gave priority to that. So really interesting to hear that echo there. And France, over to you. And it looks like you might be the concluding person here. We might be able to squeeze in one more.
Oh, no, I don't want I've already spoken so much. I don't want to take too much more. And I think one of our participants, Visakha Dharmadasa, had her hand up if we have a minute for her. But just very briefly, I wanted to pick up on this idea of streamlining. And I think that there's space for streamlining across the board. As Sanam had said, it is a challenge. There are different requirements from all donors. And so we've actually spoken to Krista about this in other venues as well, and some other donors. Is there a way to streamline some of the requirements from the bilateral donors to the larger INGOs? Because that ends up filtering onto our partners as well, right? Whatever requirements we have to meet for Canada goes to all the local organizations. So as Abir said, it trickles down. So if we can streamline that. Similarly, and ICAN is doing some research right now of talking to and looking at what all the other existing funds out there that are supporting peace building organizations, but mainly women's peace building organizations, to try and see what the linkages are, what the similarities are. So WILP would be a great example, so that we can make sure that we're also streamlining as much as possible on the INGO side to ensure that we are facilitating for our partners all the processes that they need to undergo in order to actually complete their grants. And I think that a similar question in that is kind of, what are the minimum requirements that are absolutely truly necessary? The vividness of Abir's example of having to do a procurement process with the local falafel dealer, it will not be lost on me ever. And I will probably use that in many other venues. Thank you, Abir. But it's true, right? And I heard, Beth, when you brought up timesheets, everybody's heads are nodding about the ferocity of like how intense these timesheets need to be. It's just not necessary, and actually is not at all indicative of the impact that they're having in their communities. So part of the conversations we want to be having, and this is to everybody who is here and all those who didn't get a chance to speak, we would really love to hear from you regarding the bigger questions of what the challenges are that you're seeing and what some of the responses and solutions could be. But also, we're really trying to make sure that we are streamlining across from the bilateral to the INGO and all the local organizations that are out there actually doing the work. How can we make it meet the minimum requirements that are optimizing the impact while also ensuring that we are able to track and demonstrate where the money is going? So please, you have our contact information. Please reach out to us for a direct conversation or email. We'd really love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thanks, Franz. And I think Maya is going to put some contact information in the chat. Visakha, my dear, I am so sorry. We are out of time. We didn't get to hear from Sri Lanka, which is very, very unfortunate. I think this points to the need for another discussion, hopefully soon. I'd like to, I can't sum up in the 30 seconds that I have, but just thank you to the organizers, to CIPRI, to ICAN, to all our speakers, to all of you who do this brave work every day. I think we have a strong case for the resourcing. We've heard what's needed, and what's also really, really encouraging, we've heard that there's a lot of innovative ways out to move money, to build solidarity, and to do this in a feminist and a way that will build peace and is truly consistent. So thank you to all of you, and I look forward to continuing this discussion, this important discussion, in other fora. Thank you.